name is Shannon, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about the elements of effective science instruction. I don't know if this is your experience, but when I was in school, a lot of the times I was really turned off by my science classes. I didn't think they were super interesting, and now looking back, I'm realizing that I wasn't actually doing science. A lot of the intellectual work was being done by my teachers or professors, and I was just filling in the boxes and checking things off of a list. And that's not how scientists do science. So today I want to look at a model coined by the National Research Council called the Elements of Effective Science Instruction. And this has 5 different elements that help educators to really motivate their students, really engage them to actually be doing the work themselves and being led by a teacher instead of vice versa. This framework for effective science instruction is really all about placing the students as the processors of information. It's taking a step back as a teacher, really making sure that your students are engaged and that things are relevant to their personal lives. So the first aspect of effective science instruction is motivation. First and foremost, students need to be motivated to learn anything in your class, but especially science. And a lot of educators will see this aspect of effective science instruction and just think, okay, that's just the hook that I do at the beginning of my lesson. But a hook isn't necessarily enough to keep students engaged for the whole unit or the whole lesson. You really need to keep motivating your students throughout the whole lesson. And a great way to do this is to relate it to their personal lives. If students are in your classroom learning about something and they have absolutely no reference to how this is going to further their knowledge or further their skills later in life, they're going to disengage. I know that's what I do when I know things aren't relevant for me. You can either have extrinsic or intrinsic motivation, but a lot of times extrinsic motivation is already there in science. It's the deadlines, it's the midterms, it's the labs, all the things that we need to do to get a grade. But to really hone your students' intrinsic motivation, you need to relate it to them and you need to help them see how the knowledge that they're gathering now can relate to other things in their lives. When students do projects or do labs just to complete the task, we aren't deepening their understanding or their scientific knowledge at all. Science is in everything. It's in the natural world, it's in all the technology we use, and so there is just not an excuse to not take the time and really relate your content to your students' lives. And the last thing I'll say about motivating your students is that it's super important just to step back sometimes and put yourself in their shoes and think, if I were a student, would this be cool? Would this be exciting? And would I want to learn more? Because if the answers are no, then you have an engagement issue in your class. It's so important to elicit your students' ideas because students bring their whole selves into your classroom. Your students are not going to leave themselves at the door. When they come into your classroom, they are bringing their ideas, their beliefs, and those involve things that you're going to cover in your science classrooms. And so it's really important to dig into what we already know so we can have some kind of baseline, both as a student and a teacher, to where we're going. If students know that when you put your hand up to the oven it gets hot, they can relate that knowledge to other pieces of information you're going to study about heat. So it's really important to figure out where your students are, do some formative assessments before you go forward, and students will feel like they're experts a little bit more than they are if they have a chance to dig into what they already know, why they know it. Really important to help students think about why they know things and where that comes from. Student schema is what Piaget calls complex cognitive structures. And your class is going to be full of different cognitive structures because everyone has one. And it's really important to dig into both naive understandings and incorrect understandings about phenomenon, because students will be able to use that knowledge of where they are, where their classmates are, and be able to go forward breaking down their old ideas and building up the new ones. Alright, number 3, intellectual engagement with relevant phenomenon. This aspect asks teachers to take a step back and to really let go of the reins when students are digging into the meat of lessons. When students are motivated, they're going to take this aspect of effective science instruction and they're going to be so engaged with the phenomenon because you have set them up for success. When students are feeling confident, it's usually because they've had the support to get there. And this aspect of effective science instruction, I like to think about gradual release responsibility model. This model goes from I do, we do, and to you do, where the I do is where teachers are modeling, setting up examples and scaffolding, and the we do is where explanations come into play, and then the you do is where students are able to go out and find evidence and critique claims. Number 4, use of evidence to critique claims. When students are talking about scientific phenomenon, when they are doing experiments, they're constantly finding evidence. And it's really important in your science classroom to hone how important it is to find evidence and using that evidence then to either support or critique claims that are made by your peers, by your teachers, or from other scientists. It's really important with this element of effective science teaching that you take the time to process what evidence means with your students. When students use evidence that either they've found themselves or evidence from research they've done themselves to critique or support claims that they're making, it will change their cognitive framework. When students can use that evidence and demonstrate that their thinking has changed, either write it out, talk it out, or have debates over claims made in science, especially when students use evidence that they've found themselves to work with claims and either support or critique them, it heightens the chance that they are changing their thinking from what they thought before to what they're thinking now. This is a great way to figure out what your students have learned from the lesson if you're asking them to either agree or disagree with a general statement and asking them to use the evidence that they've gathered. This really, really hones what scientists do. The last and arguably the most important element of effective science teaching is sense making. Sense making will happen at multiple different stages of the science process, but primarily towards the end of a unit or a lesson. It's really important for teachers to be dynamic in this session because if they're asking the appropriate questions, they can help students get from point A to point B to point C, and they can help connect the dots between what they've done in experiments, what they've talked about in lecture, and what they have seen maybe in different media sources or experienced in life. And I think sense making is really important to just make sure that you implement into your classes. A lot of times teachers will just end the lesson before they have time to really make sure all of their students understand what's going on and take a second to reflect on what they knew at the beginning of the lesson and how their thinking has changed. I also think this is a great place to apply the knowledge that you're learning to different contexts. If your students can use the information that they've gathered and learned and pivot and apply that to a different context, that proves to you as a teacher that they've really understood that phenomenon and that their thinking is flexible enough to be concrete.